Good afternoon and welcome to the National League of Cities. I usually say that welcome to City Hall, but the mayor of Washington, D.C. is here, so I won't say that. But welcome to your City Hall away from home. If you're not from Washington, D.C., this is the National League of Cities. My name is Clarence Anthony. I'm the CEO and Executive Director of the National League of Cities. Thank you for that clap, Polly. Polly, I appreciate that. You know, everyone in this room knows that housing is in a state of crisis in America. And cities, towns, and villages are on the front line of dealing with this issue. Rising home prices and stagnant wages have put tremendous strain on the housing market across America. Communities of all sizes are dealing with their own set of unique housing and community challenges. That's why last November, more than 20 local leaders from across the country came together to form the National League of Cities Housing Taskforce, chaired by Washington, D.C. Mayor Muriel. The goal of the task force was to examine the causes of the housing crisis, spotlight innovative solutions being implemented at the local level, and create a set of policy recommendations to support the millions of Americans that are in need of adequate and affordable housing. Today, we are excited to have you here at the launch of our new comprehensive housing report named Homeward Bound, The Road to Affordable Housing. Homeward Bound is the product of the task force over 6 months of work, which uncover how we can come together to ensure every American has a place that they call home. The ultimate goal of the task force was to create a comprehensive report on the state of housing in our country with tangible, implementable recommendations to help ensure every person in our country has a safe, affordable place that they truly can call home. The conclusions of the report focus on local actions that can and should be taken, as well as actions we need as a partner from the federal level. And as we enter the 2020 presidential election cycle, we want to make sure that we set a marker for every candidate that is running for president, that they make clear that their platform includes a vision for housing, which is essential to addressing this issue. Now, the areas of the task force and the areas that they focused on were 5 areas: local financing, land use regulation, planning and partnerships, as well as overcoming historical inequities, and again, having that federal partner. Whether it's in Washington, D.C., the Housing Preservation Fund is an example of how local leaders are taking action on addressing the housing needs. In D.C., what they did was they helped preserve more than 800 units of affordable housing since 2018 using the Housing Preservation Fund. Or in Bozeman, Montana, where the city has standardized their accessory dwelling unit requirements to make it easier for homeowners to use them. Or in San Antonio, Texas, they have a program called Under One Roof, which replaces failing roofs with free energy efficient roofs that help address a range of health, energy, as well as environmental issues for those that are living in the house. Or in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which has developed the Anti-Displacement Plan, which is preserving and protecting housing choices for low-income families that are at risk for displacement. This is just a sample of some of the case studies you'll find in the report. All of the examples inform the local recommendations that the task force came up with, because in order to make this happen, we made sure that the tools that were being proposed were actionable and implementable. Some of the tools, and we'll discuss this later, includes developing local tools and direct local financing to cities. It's a focus on land use regulation that support safe and affordable housing, leveraging data, partnerships, and comprehensive housing strategies, support the need for distinct subpopulations of folks that's living in the communities, and prioritize equitable outcomes in housing decisions. The other part of the report focuses on having a stronger federal partner. Now, there are a couple of things that, in order to have a federal partner, that the report calls out. Stabilizing public and affordable housing in our nation, passing a long-term federal housing bill, modernizing land use and planning at the local and regional level, fixing the inequities in the housing finance system, and supporting scalable innovation and financing for local communities. There's a lot in this report, and I hope that everyone will dig into this report, but not just dig in it to read it, but dig in it to make a difference in the lives of people that live in the communities that city leaders lead. We're asking the leaders of cities to look at this report, but also the staff of cities, city leaders, to dig into this report so that we, again, can make sure that we give answers to this crisis of housing in our nation. Without further ado, I'd like to bring up the experts, the leaders who are leading our nation's cities and dealing with this issue, who will be on stage to talk about the report, but more importantly, talk about how they are dealing with it in their community. First, I'd like to ask National League of Cities President Mayor Karen Freeman Wilson of Gary, Indiana, who founded the task force last November and appointed the task force members, to come up. Our amazing chair of our task force, our hometown mayor, Washington, D.C.'s Mayor Muriel Bowser. And Seattle Council member Teresa Moscata, who served as one of the 22 members of the staff of the task force. If you're in the room or listening remotely, to tweet out any great quotes in support of our recommendations, use the hashtag Leaders for Housing. So I'm going to have the honor of facilitating this panel with our leaders here today. And we're going to get right into it. And I'm going to start with our chair of our task force. And I'll ask all of you this, but I'll start with Mayor Bowser. The national housing affordability crisis affects every city, town, and village across America. But it's felt differently according to your cities, whether it's Seattle, Washington, D.C., or Gary. How are you feeling the effect in Washington, D.C., and perhaps what are some of the ways in which you're dealing with the housing crisis?
Sure. Well, thank you for that question, Clarence. And I want to thank Mayor Freeman Wilson for pulling mayors together, officials, housing officials, legislators from across the nation to talk about what we all know to be very critical to the people who live in our cities. When people are housing burdened, spending more than 30%, some in many cases, over 50% of their income on housing. We know that they think about those costs each and every day, and they affect other parts of their lives, their transportation, their health, their employment, and even the achievement of their children. So in our city, we put housing policy first because we know when families have stable housing, they can take care of all of those things. And Mayor Freeman Wilson was very right in making sure that our membership reflected how different cities and towns are dealing with housing. Our issue may be that we just need more of it, that we need to stabilize public housing, that we need housing for people of all incomes. In other cities, we found that they're dealing with vacancy and how the city can be involved with vacancy. All of us, well, most of us, were dealing with how do we have policies that can deal with 50-year-old policies that made the housing patterns such that they are now in 2019. So we have represented in this report cities of more than 500,000 like we are in smaller places as well. People who are dealing with rising housing costs and the pressure of how we create more housing and stabilize more housing at the same time. And others who are really trying to manage vacant land, government-owned land, and make all of those policies work. Above it all, and you have mentioned that we're doing all the things that we can locally. And in some cases, we picked out every tool from our toolbox, and we're looking for new tools to add to our toolbox. But we know the federal government cannot be absent from this conversation. And the thing that I'll mention, while we can talk a lot about what we're doing around housing, and this report makes very clear that where the federal government has public housing in cities and towns across the United States of America, they can't walk away from it. None of us can afford to lose that housing. And in many cases, thousands and thousands and thousands of our units are in a state of deterioration. So how we have a nationwide policy to deal with saving those units is going to be critical.
Madam President, any thoughts?
Absolutely. First and foremost, I just want to thank Mayor Bowser and Council Member Mosqueda for first chairing the task force, for hosting our first convening, and for your leadership and for participating. And for, the great thing about this task force was that people were so engaged from start to finish. I mean, we've all been in those meetings where people are doing this, looking at their phones and, halfway paying attention. But in this instance, people were engaged. They were, talking, excited to discuss the issues because Mayor Bowser is right. These are the very issues that keep us up at night in our communities, that challenge us to be better leaders to our citizens, because it's not just the fact that folks need to have housing, it's that we want them to have a place that they call home. I look around this room and everybody that goes in the house, whether you go to your home at 5 or 10 p.m., there's a sense of relief. There's a sense of sanctuary there. And, everybody doesn't have that. And so what this task force came together to do, in my mind, and what I really wanted us to do, is to look at those nuts and bolts actions that we can take as city leaders, whether you are in Moss Point, Mississippi, or whether you are in New York City, to say, these are the things that I need to do in my community to make it better. Right now in Gary, we're dealing with the issue that our public housing, certain units, we have about 600 units that need to be retired. They needed to be retired 30 years ago. And so everybody agrees that they need to go away, but how do you, even though we're giving vouchers to those citizens, how do you help with deposits, security deposits? Because now it's a different venue that you're living in. How do you deal with those things? And so this is something that we want to be a living, breathing document for city leaders. And the whole point of starting early and ending now is to allow folks the rest of the year and then to plan for subsequent years the implementation of this work.
Councilmember Wisconsin.
Well, first I want to say thank you. Thank you to the National League of Cities. Thank you to these incredible mayors for the convening and the hosting of this task force. I was proud to be part of this housing task force and proud to share the innovative policy solutions that Seattle has really put forward, especially in the last 5 years, but also to collectively come together with other cities across the country to talk about what needs to be done and the reason that we're in this situation. If you look at the report, within the first few pages, it explicitly talks about the country's racialized zoning and exclusionary housing policies that have historically led us to the crisis that we're in, that have permanently altered the state of housing across the country. This is a critically important element for us as cities, as city leaders, to take on head on so that we can adequately address the housing crisis. In Seattle, we are still suffering from this historic legacy of redlining, racist, exclusionary policies that have redlined certain communities and excluded much of our population from high opportunity neighborhoods. At the same time, because of those zoning policies of the past, we have much of our city, about 3/4 of our city, that's been exclusively zoned for single-family homes. And when we don't historically look at the roots of our zoning policies and proactively make policy solutions that get at that racist past, then we're never going to undo our current housing crisis. We're never going to create inclusive zoning policies that will adequately meet our community's needs. And we're not going to be able to address the housing crisis of today that result in inaffordability and, quite frankly, homelessness. Here we are representing cities from coast to coast. And it's no coincidence. Across this country, from East Coast to West Coast, we have a crisis of affordability and we have a crisis of homelessness. In fact, in our own city, in the city of Seattle, we know we need 156,000 affordable housing units just to meet today's need. We also know that that's a conservative estimate. Speaking of conservative estimates, we got more than 11,000 homeless people living outside in the city of Seattle. Half of those, are living outside. Half of them are living in shelters. If you're living in a shelter, you are still homeless. So we have a mandate as city leaders to look at these past policies, look at our current policies, and figure out ways that we can, as you said, scale up our commitment and our solutions to housing policies. Because the consequences, people are getting pushed out, they're getting priced out, we're losing neighbors, and we're losing lives. Last year, we saw the highest number of folks who died in our streets because they were houseless. We saw an increase in homelessness in terms of kiddos in our schools, increased by 3 times the number that they were at in 2010. And we saw about half of our families, we saw about 45,000 families in Seattle spending half of their income. Usually we measure whether or not housing is affordable by whether or not you're spending about 1/3 of your income. Half of their income was going towards housing. So this is a crisis that has, quite frankly, gripped our communities, and we have been unable to adequately address it because of a lack of federal dollars. As the report points out, we are on track to see the federal spending on housing go to an all-time low in 40 years. We have been trying at the local level to address the housing crisis. Through local funding, we are proud of our Seattle levy efforts, through rezoning efforts, frankly, through some of the efforts that have taken us years of legal delays that are very gentle infill options like the accessory dwelling units that you talked about. And at every turn, we have run into opposition, mostly from folks who got theirs, who feel like they have theirs and they don't want to share.
Right.
And we need the federal government to step up in terms of long-term, stable financial assistance and to help raise the floor in terms of federal policies, just like we've done with labor standards, just like we've done with civil rights policy. We need the federal government to step up and raise the bar so we can quite literally build upon that new foundation and create affordable housing for all of our communities.
Between affordability, accessibility, race, and equity, and the historical policies that have impacted housing. How have you dealt with the legacy policies and the housing situation in Washington, D.C.? And Mayor Freeman Wilson, the same question.
Well, many people in our city have been at the forefront. I think about the neighborhood I live in, which was really the epicenter of block busting in the District of Columbia. And you can look all over our city and see remnants of a segregated Washington, D.C. You can look at, for example, and this is just one generation ago, my parents lived in a segregated Washington, D.C. And you can look at the number of school buildings that we have, for example. And it's probably twice the number of buildings that we have because we had a system for the white kids and a system for the black kids. And those are the remnants of our segregation past. You can look at how mortgages, insurance, and other things were sold in our city and know that people did not have equal opportunity. Even people who were able were unable because of these policies. And so that is it's very significant to how our city was developed. And when we think about the progress that we have made in our city, and certainly we have made a lot, it hasn't been equally distributed. You will hear a lot of conversation in Washington about how inviting more people and welcoming more people and recruiting more people to our city has contributed to the crisis that we are experiencing. You will hear many people talking about the demographic change in our city. You know what the nickname for Washington, D.C. is, right? Chocolate City.
Yeah.
It's interesting that many people don't know that. Didn't know that here because we see just a shift in who's living here and who can't afford to live here. And so that's very critical to what we do too. So housing policy is one set of the way we deal with how more people can afford to live in DC. And certainly we're very aggressive around all of those things. But we're also focused on how we have the types of jobs in our city and how DC residents can get those jobs to be able to afford to live in that city. I've said to my team early on, and our city administrator is here, our housing policy director is here, is that we have to work on all of those things at the same time. So the city's part is in investing in making, basically buying down affordability in units. We just advanced through our city council our comprehensive plan, and a key tenet of that comprehensive plan is equity and affordability and making sure we are putting policies in place to push against displacement of people. And the big thing and the big job that mayors have, and I think that the mayor will agree, is that we want cities that are growing and thriving and businesses locating and people moving into your town. That's absolutely what you want. But you also want to be able to manage that growth so that you aren't displacing people from your city. The challenge that we'll have moving forward, even in the discussion that we're having about public housing, our public housing authority is going through a study now of the entire portfolio. And they have recently submitted a request to tear down a good section of their portfolio because it has gone into such a state of disrepair. So what is going to be the new paradigm for public housing? If it's not the federal government owning it and operating it, then what is going to be the new paradigm? Does the shift to a more private model support our residents who need it the most? So those are some of the key things, because sometimes when we talk about racial disparities, we don't talk about the failed housing policies that now we are addressing when it comes to public housing, and we need to address that too.
Yeah, it's interesting because the report talks about housing being one of the strongest economic indicators for success for anyone in America, because that's your biggest, sometimes that's folks' biggest investment. And if you never get that chance to have home ownership, you never get a chance to get that head start, if you will.
Well, that is another key remnant of segregation in slavery, because you don't have generations that have passed down housing and equity and down payment assistance and education assistance on to the next family. And that's another thing, a way that we have stepped in. If your mom and dad aren't giving you a chunk of money for your down payment, well, how are you going to get it? You going to work 10 years? You going to work? So those are some things that we can also do to help level the playing field. And we have had a very successful program for many years that's first-time home buyers assistance called HPAP for our employees, district government. We add on a little bit more to it for our teachers and firefighters. I'm trying to get another program to help add on to it for them as well. So you have that home buyers assistance. In a city like ours, we run the risk of only the very rich being able to live here, and the people who are the lowest incomes who qualify for the most subsidy. And the people in the middle get bupkis. They pay a lot of taxes and they get nothing. And so that is also a group. And sometimes that's a difficult conversation to have among policy makers, because, and it's a fair argument to have, but I argue that you need people of every income living in a city, and not just people on the ends.
Mayor Freeman Wilson?
I think that the mayor is absolutely right. And one of the things that came out during the discussion with the task force is that we have to think about equity and inclusion at every angle as we look to resolve this issue. So whether you're talking about affordability at every level, whether you are talking about homelessness, whether you're talking about the nexus between transportation and housing, between education and housing, you have to look at the impact that each of those subjects have on equity and inclusion, and not just look at it, but come up with a solution that provides an opportunity for everyone in your community. And, in some communities are more diverse than others, but whether it is a diversity that is based on race and national origin, or whether it is a diversity based on gender or disability or any of the other areas, we understand that in making sure that we address the housing crisis in our communities, that we have to look at every aspect of equity and inclusion, and to determine how do you infuse that in every conversation so that the solutions that we come up with at the local level really do provide ladders of opportunity for our constituents.
Councilmember Mosqueda, the report sort of outlines how our country got into this state it is in regards to the housing crisis, and sort of face the stark reality that city leaders need some recommendations in order to really get to the bottom line of how do we improve the lives of people. Why was it important to you and for the task force to make specific recommendations for the local level as well as the federal level, because we do recognize in the report that historically there have been policies of the local level that's got us into this situation. But why did we also recognize both local and federal? Why do you think we did?
I think the report is really great at both calling out the historic federal policies, backed mortgages that had color-coded requirements that really fueled the opportunity for mostly white homeowners to be able to get out of generational poverty while leaving many of our communities of color and our lowest wage workers behind. It also calls out the fact that in many of our cities throughout recent history, I would say within the last 5 or 6 decades, we have seen local governments exacerbate this reality by not being able to fully step up, fund housing, by not being able to rezone city zoning policies, by not being able to protect renters and tenants. When we have local electeds who listen to the loudest, often well-funded voices, what you see is a doubling down of those past policies. And the same is true in the city of Seattle. Over the last 5 to 7 decades, we actually saw a downzoning in local city policies, restricting even more of our land to small pockets around the city where we could actually create multifamily housing. That meant that renters had fewer and fewer spaces where they could actually have an affordable unit. In a city like Seattle, we need to be able to level the playing field, and much of the policies that are called out in this report give tools, give implementable tools for our toolkit that cities can act on immediately to learn from best practices, to talk about the type of opposition that we've run into, and to be able to identify ways that we at the local level can better accelerate our commitment to equity in housing, and recognizes that when we do so, we're actually able to leverage additional funds. It is critical for us to have a both-and approach here. When we have been able at the City of Seattle to leverage private and public dollars from the federal and the state level, we have been able to take every one city dollar and turn it into $5. That makes an affordable unit around $55,000 to build instead of $350,000. It is critical that we both have state and local funding sources, and that we have state, city, and federal policy solutions that are actively getting at unrooting this past practice in terms of racist policies. And I think it's incumbent on us to not think that, oh, that's a past practice, that, you know, maybe if we do a little bit here, a little bit there, that we'll be okay, we can catch up. We are never going to catch up if we don't have true policy reform at the federal level and at the local level. If you look in the city of Seattle, these redlining covenants that excluded much of our community and coupled together communities of colors in certain areas throughout Seattle, what you see, especially in the South End, was that communities were resilient. We created community, we created culture, we created vibrant neighborhoods, and in the city of Seattle, in the South End, and in the Central District, we used to have about 70% of our population be African American in that neighborhood. That was in the 70s and 60s. Now, if you look at that exact same neighborhood, it's less than 1/5. It's about 20% African American. In that neighborhood, you used to, just 6 years ago in 2012, be able to afford to buy a home at $222,000. That's about a $50,000 salary. Now, in order to get a home in that, quote, affordable area of Seattle, you need at least around $200,000 because the average cost of a home has increased 3 times to be over $660,000. That is out of reach, and it's only happened within the last 6 years. So yes, we are working as hard as we can, as fast as we can, in the face of tremendous opposition at the local level. But that's precisely why we need the federal government to step in. And as we look at the federal government and ask them to step in, we're cognizant of the fact that the last time we've done major national reform, major national funding policies on housing, it left much of our population out. So as we ask for the federal government to step in, we're going to center communities of color, center those who've been mostly left out, center those who are getting pushed out and displaced out of our cities. And it's critical that we do this with the federal resources. I want more money for vouchers. I want that National Housing Trust Fund. I want there to be a 10-year stable funding source that our cities can build upon. We cannot address this crisis alone. And obviously the crisis of housing and homelessness is far bigger than any city border. But it is far too important to wait for someone else to step in. We are all in this together.
Mayor Bowser, what if you had to, thank you, Councilman, what one federal program would you like to see strengthened or created that you've seen work or something you would design?
One thing that I've seen work is the federal voucher assistance for veterans. And it was something that I've actually seen carried through from the Obama administration to the current administration. And it fits into, it crosses a lot of lines. People like to support veterans. People should support veterans. We in cities really know how to find, support, and work with veterans to get them in a place where they can be housed. And so we need to continue to have that voucher assistance for veterans. What I would like to see the federal government do more of is around emergency rental assistance, which we had some discussion around. The one thing that we have found in the city is it's much cheaper, much more effective, and much more helpful for a family to prevent them from getting in the homeless system in the first place. And sometimes it could only mean 3 months of support. It could only mean helping a family member help maintain their family in a safe and affordable home. And we think that is so fast. It could be such a fast cash assistance program that we know well how to administer. More than that, the federal government, and I've mentioned this a lot, I'll beat this drum forever, is the public housing units. We need a new paradigm for public housing because walking away and privatizing it all is not something that has worked. And we've had a few iterations from Hope 6 to the new program that they're trying to push us all to reposition our public housing units. Right. Yeah. We're not sure what that means or what it's going to mean for people being displaced out of cities that they love. And that's not what we want. So we want to reposition the units, but we want people to be able to stay in their communities.
Freeman Wilson.
You know, if I thought about a federal program that I think is particularly useful, I certainly like the VASH program, the Assistance to Veterans, but I would say choice neighborhoods. And the reason that I say that is that it has proven successful. It is comprehensive. It not only looks at housing, but it looks at schools. We've already talked about that. It looks at the public housing authorities have a significant role to play in that, and it looks at public safety. All of these are tied together. All of them have an impact on not just the housing, but the quality of people's lives. And Clarence, you know, one thing I omitted at the beginning, and I can't say this enough, I just want to give a hand and a round of applause to you and the staff. You know, we sat at the table and we ran our mouths, but the staff actually came up with the product, and it is just a phenomenal working document. And I just want to thank the NLC staff for
thank them. Let's give our. I actually had that note at the end to thank our staff, both DC as well as NLC staff. They did a great job. But I'm going to tell you, that chair of that task force didn't play.
She was exacting.
She cut it off. She managed it, and I didn't think we'd end on time. But Mayor Bowser, you run a tight meeting. You got me scared there.
Oh.
But no, you did a very good job, and thank you so much for that compliment. Mayor, we need to go for a few minutes to Q&A. Okay. Because we started a few minutes late. But do we have any questions from the audience of the panel?
Can I add one more thing to our wish list for our federal friends?
Yeah, come on.
Well, first, I want to thank our Washington State Senator Maria Cantwell, who's part of a task force here in D.C. that is pulling together efforts to look at affordable housing crisis across the country. I really appreciate that effort. So I will underscore, because it's already been talked about, the need for money, and the report calls out $30 billion in emergency funds. I will underscore the efforts to prevent displacement and to reinvest in our housing structure that has been long ignored and is at risk of being dilapidated without additional federal funds. And I will also add to that, we need additional federal policy to protect tenants and renters. We've done a lot at the local level to try to make sure that just cause ordinances were put into place, that we had fair housing policies so that people who had previous criminal convictions weren't excluded from rental housing. We need federal policy to protect renters and protect tenants. That would be a tremendous asset to local governments.
I agree 100%. Any questions for the task force?
Did I successfully filibuster? For there to be a question.
I have one more question. President Trump a couple of weeks ago sent out or created an executive order talking about the many challenges that local governments have put in place, impediments to creating affordable housing. With that as a background, how do we make sure that we stay above and push this report and encourage that balanced approach between the local and the federal level partnership? How do we do that? Because we're doing our part. How do we make sure that there's a balance programming there with the federal level? Anybody?
I think that we have to talk about the importance of partnership. And that was integral to all parts and all sections of the report. So we can't say that it's the federal government that's not doing their part. We can't say it's the state government that's not doing their part. So to say that it's local regulations that are creating the housing crisis is short-sighted. And so we all have a role to play. And are there some local regulations that might be modified or tweaked? Absolutely. But there are also federal regulations, there are state regulations, and what we understand is that those local regulations, more often than not, you talk about the protection for tenants, are there to protect people. And so if we work together more often and more concertedly, then what we'll find is that we can work as units, as state and federal and local government to protect people. And you won't have to worry about that dichotomy, if you will. But, I think that the report that was issued that as a part of the executive order was just a part of the solution. But I'm hopeful and very optimistic that we can work with the White House, that we can work with HUD, that we can work with all of the departments, the Department of Veterans Affairs, to provide a place called home to all of our citizens.
I don't really know where they were going with that executive order, to be honest with you. But I'm open to looking at ways to, as the mayor said, to streamline our processes. We have some cumbersome processes too, and if they're serious about having people who are empowered to be a liaison from the agencies to our local partners, then we would be absolutely all for that. I did want to add one last thing, Clarence. You mentioned earlier, you asked the council member, why do you think it's important to have these local recommendations? And I think it's hugely important to have a document like this because we are all kind of singing from the same hymn book here. And some people have to be converted. And so it is good not to try to, you can't always be the, what's the term, a prophet in your own land, all right? And so if we can go to our partners and say, look, they're doing it in this town, it's like us, and this is not such a, you may not be able to get your hands around using $10 million of local dollars that you had been using over here. And somebody having to pitch to you that this will really help 800, not just units, because sometimes we talk about units so much when we talk about housing. These are people, these are families, these are kids in schools, this is a grandma that doesn't have to go to a nursing home. It's all of these different people that can be helped by that product. And that's why I always like looking at best practices and things that have worked in other cities, so that we're not recreating the wheel. If I found something that worked in Gary, not only can I work with my team on it, I can sell that to our policymakers and the taxpayers who I may be asking to support it. We can also use a document like this for all the people who want our help, our support, our vote. You know, it's the season, 'tis the season. And we have very much looked at the practices that have worked, and they are developing those housing platforms as we speak. And so this report gives us the opportunity to have a good reference document for them to say, these are cities and you're going to be in some of these cities. You're going to be in some of these towns over the next several months. And you get to see what their officials have said are the pain points, the things that have worked, and the things that they are looking to do.
Mayor, I was like, Mayor?
Oh, well, that, by osmosis. So it's really exciting, I think, right now, from now and for the next 18 months or so, to talk about how we make this a central part of any political conversation going forward. But it also shouldn't be held over until the next election. This is a crisis that deserves action now. From our current Congress to our current city council members to our current mayors, we have the opportunities to step up and make sure that this is not just a wish list, but this is a to-do item in the near future. You know, when it comes to President Trump and the declaration that all we need to do is get rid of some of the zoning requirements and restrictions that have been placed on housing. Well, you know what? That is one subcomponent of one recommendation among many in our report. We obviously know that there's more that we can do to streamline permitting. That is not the solution to creating affordable housing. And he got elected on a promise to rebuild America, to create infrastructure, to create housing. We need housing now. And what we're asking for is national partnership so that local electeds can help address the fair housing crisis that we have in many of our communities, to protect tenants, to make sure that we have the dollars in hand to have the capital to build housing, and that we collectively work together to raise the floor so that that national platform can be something that cities can build upon. We have a crisis that is not just resulting in affordability, but it's resulting in a healthcare crisis. Those who are living in dilapidated housing and unsafe housing have higher rates of asthma and cardiovascular diseases, higher stress. This is an environmental crisis. People who are concerned about environment and sprawl ought to be pushing for affordable housing and density within our cities. We can do that at the same time that we protect tree canopies and create greater green spaces. This is an economic justice issue, a racial justice issue, a gender justice issue. Those who are at higher risk of housing discrimination experience housing discrimination at higher rates when we don't have a high supply of housing. And it's mostly women, people of color, the LGBTQ population. So we're talking about, yes, getting out of generational poverty by creating first-time home ownership options, by creating more affordable rental units, and by creating, I think, hopefully, the political will to tackle this as one of the most pressing policy issues that deserves our attention. There's the author of The Color of Law that talks about our housing crisis being rooted in past public policies. It's going to take political will to pass public policies now to undo, to right those historic wrongs so that we can create housing as the true human right that it is.
With that, well said, and amen. I think that's right. And, you know, the one thing the report calls out is a word called leadership. And it's going to take leaders like we have on this panel and leaders all over America to address this issues. And it also take partnerships. We have a partner with mayors and CEOs for housing that we're working with, and I'm excited about this report. Thanks to our chair, our president, council member, thank you, and the entire task force, and the team at National League of Cities and Washington, D.C. You guys did an amazing job. And now the work begins, because we got to use this to make a home for everybody who live in cities. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.